So welcome this afternoon. My name is Robert Mays, and this is my wife, Suzanne. We are NDE researchers, and we have been following the NDE research literature since 1975 with Raymond Moody's book. We started serious research in NDEs in 2005, and this is the result that we've come so far. So today, Suzanne and I would like to present some new insights we have had about how the mind works with the brain. We consider the mind to be an autonomous, non-material entity that is the seat of one's consciousness. The main objective of our research is to demonstrate the reality of that independent autonomous mind in ordinary consciousness. The basis for our work is the evidence that comes from near-death experiences and various neurological phenomena. We also draw on philosophical and other wisdom sources. You can read more about our research at our website, selfconsciousmind.com. So we start with the phenomenology of NDEs. A near-death experience is a profound psychological event that occurs generally when one is near to death or in a state of extreme psychological or physical distress. NDEs contain a number of characteristic elements and typically are followed by significant after effects like increased sensitivities, profound changes of attitude, and loss of fear of death. The phenomenology of NDEs implies separation of the mind or psyche from the physical body during the NDE, and then a sense of returning to the body. With a sense of separation from the body, there is no pain, and prior disabilities are absent. These both return on the return to the body. There are lucid thought processes, hyperreal perceptions, and one's volition responds instantly. There are subtle interactions with physical processes like light and sound. In interacting with solid objects, there can be a sense of change in density or slight resistance in passing through a wall or other object. The following points particularly demonstrate that the mind separates and continues to function in an NDE. First, NDEs frequently report verified accurate perceptions. These are called apparently non-physical veridical perceptions, AVPs. The veridical perceptions frequently occur outside the range of physical senses. They are possible only if the locus of awareness has separated from the physical body, like down the hall and in another state. They frequently occur when brain function is compromised, as in cardiac arrest. The recently published book, The Self Does Not Die, has over 100 cases of verified paranormal phenomena, with 67 cases specifically of AVPs verified by a third party. The second point is, while out of the body, NDEs have accurate recall of their prior life memories, and they form new memories of their NDE. Memories from the NDE do not fade. They are vivid and are relived when they are recalled. Several studies have shown now that NDE memories have more characteristics and are experienced as more real even than memories of real events. Third, NDEs generally have instantaneous access to all of their prior semantic knowledge, word meanings, world knowledge, recognition of objects, and so on. And finally, the separate mind entity is objectively real. There are several verified cases where the NDEer was seen by one or several others, and there was a verified exchange of information. So we hold that the mind entity is something separate from the physical body, having a number of implied characteristics. First, the mind entity is the seat of consciousness of the person, the essence of the person. All mental functions and capacities are in the mind. These include perceptions, thoughts, feelings, volition, memory formation and recall, semantic and world knowledge. So there are two states of the mind as shown here. One, united with the brain, and two, separate from the brain. Now, in the out-of-body state, the mind operates independently of the brain and body. This is seen in the hyperreal perceptions, the vivid indelible memory formation, and the instant response to volition. The mind interacts directly with light and sound and physical matter. These are direct energetic interactions that produce awareness in the NDE. In the body, the mind is united and coextensive with the brain and body, operating as an autonomous entity within it. The mind interacts through neural activity in the brain, for example, through the sense organs, to produce awareness in the mind. In this state, the mind is dependent on brain activity. Consciousness in the body is diminished from the hyperreal level in NDEs, and thought processes are constrained. Now, to shift gears, we want to give you an experience of visual perception to develop an understanding of how the mind works with the brain. We have a short video with two different types of visual experiences, pairs of images, and sentences to read one word at a time. So here's how it will work. Each visual stimulus is preceded by a white plus sign for 1 second. So when you see that, focus your attention. Each stimulus is then flashed very quickly for 50 milliseconds. It's important to pay attention so you don't miss the image. Due to technical limitations, some images may not show. First, we'll present several pairs of images. Then we'll present two simple sentences, a sequence of words, 1 per second. So here it is. This is the first pair of images. Second pair. Third pair. And then sentence 1. And sentence 2. Okay. So starting with the two sentences, could you read the words? Did everybody read the words pretty well? Yeah? Okay. Did you notice anything unusual about the sentences? What was it? Peanut is in love, yes. Now the pairs of images, did you see each image? Sometimes they are not shown. And did you recognize what each image was? The second image was a contrast to the first image. Maybe it was a little jarring compared to the first. So for example, we had Einstein, and then we had, who was it? No, not Marilyn Monroe. More modern, 21st century. Lady Gaga. Yes, somebody is up on these things. All right. All of these images were easy to recognize, even with a very short exposure time. Now we'd like to present a final visual image, allowing for an extended time to view it. So this is a picture, a simple image, but many people have a hard time initially seeing what it is. Has anyone seen this image before? Anyone? Raise your hand. Okay. Does anybody recognize what it is now? Okay, well then I'll give you a few hints. But first I'm going to say that initially all perception starts with an unprocessed image, the given. Initially there is no organization, no segmentation of the image, and no conceptual content. You don't see anything there. It's a meaningless display of black and white shapes. To recognize the image, one needs to get the organizing concept of the image. So this is the figure of a man, a bearded man, some might say a religious figure. Does anybody see it now, given that? Ooh. Oh, somebody does, okay. So this, for those who don't, this is the outline of the man. Starting here, going up here to his head, down to his shoulder and arm. And this is his head and beard, mustache, his nose, his eyes. Do more people see it now? Okay. All right. Well, those that don't, we'll give you some more time and we'll actually show this later. There's generally a definite moment when one finally sees the image. When that happens, one sees the image all at once in its correct context, correct segmentation. One sees what it is. This is an experience of intuition. One's mind has added something new to the earlier jumble, the percept, what your eyes are seeing, has added something new, namely the concept of the image. Now this is a case of delayed recognition that shows that there are two steps in recognition. The first step is the percept, without any segmentation of the image, without any meaning. And the second step is intuiting the concept. With this image, one has the experience of the two distinct steps. But in the video, the image is there, you got it right away. And in most cases, the concept is apprehended almost immediately in the mind through intuition. So you can see the contrast. Now, to understand consciousness, we need to explore the semantic and conceptual content of consciousness. Where do the concepts come from such that we can recognize an object, a face, a word, even after only 50 milliseconds of visual stimulus? Where are the concepts stored, in quotes? This knowledge, conceptual knowledge, is generally characterized as semantic knowledge, word meanings, and so on. World knowledge, facts about the world. Experiential knowledge, mental pictures from experience. Episodic memory, memory of life events. How can we so easily parse or segment images into recognized objects? In most cases, as I said, one's intuition appears to be instantaneous. And how do we integrate words or images into the prior context? What if we detect a semantic incongruity, like the peanut is in love? We submit that our mind entity hypothesis does a better job of explaining these phenomena than the current physicalist view that the brain generates consciousness. So to address these questions based on the evidence from NDEs, here is our view. The mind is an energetic entity that interfaces with the brain, as depicted by this yellow overlaying area of the brain. Concepts and meaning, semantic knowledge and memory reside in the mind. Perceptions begin in the brain with sensory brain processes, and these are called exogenous processes coming from outside. But the conceptual semantic content comes from the mind through intuition. Thoughts, feelings, urges, volitional processes begin in the mind. And these are so-called endogenous processes starting from within, and activate neural processes in the mind, in the brain, so that they come to awareness. Memories are formed from episodic events of your life, and through neural processes they are formed, neural processes in the hippocampus, they are formed in the mind. And they are recalled from the mind through, again, through the hippocampus. Semantic knowledge is formed through experience and is recalled again through intuition. If the idea of the mind entity is real, there should be ample evidence of its presence in the brain processes during ordinary waking consciousness. So at this point, we need to give some background on brain structure, dynamics, and imaging. We need to be familiar with these two views of the brain: the outside or lateral view of the left hemisphere with different areas of interest, and the middle inside or medial surface of the right hemisphere, again with the area of interest of the primary visual area. Now these images are blown up like a balloon to reveal the complete brain surface. So that includes the folds or sulci, which are shown in darker gray. Now there are two main methods for imaging what is happening in real time. We need to know what's happening millisecond by millisecond. And there are two methods, electroencephalography, EEG, and magnetoencephalography, MEG. EEG measures electrical voltage fluctuations at the scalp, measured in plus or minus volts. And here's a picture of how they are plotted with a picture of the top of the head. And this area is negative or bluish. And the positive area here is reddish or yellowish. And we won't get into advantages and disadvantages. Magnetoencephalography measures, instead of voltages, magnetic fluctuations at the scalp. And then can, because they are magnetic fluctuations, can infer what's going on as neural activations in a particular location. So the fluctuations in MEG, like in EEG, are associated with cognitive functions. And the MEG plots usually plot either brain activations colored in yellows and reds, or as the areas that are primarily activated for each subject shown as single dots. So here's an example from EEG of an incongruent word in a sentence that evokes a strong minus voltage at the top of the scalp. So this is the top of the head, the nose, the ears. And so the minus voltages here are in this slightly different color, but this is a strong negative voltage right here, and it is measured here at N400, 400 milliseconds in. And it's a negative. So this graph, in this graph, negative voltages are plotted up, and time is plotted along the x-axis. So at 115 milliseconds, the N1 voltage, so this is the looking at a single word. At 115 milliseconds, the N1 minus voltage is associated with detecting the word percept, the form of the word. And the target word in this sentence that is shown here is Y-E-L-L-O-W, as in the Dutch trains are yellow. And so that is the detection of the percept. And then at a positive voltage at P2, 200 milliseconds, detecting the meaning of the word, the meaning of the concept yellow, which is a bright, warm color. And then at 400 milliseconds, there is, in the different cases, there is towards a negative voltage at 400 milliseconds showing how the awareness of how congruent or incongruent the word is in the context. So yellow is congruent because Dutch strains are in fact yellow. This is an example of world knowledge. If we say the Dutch strains are white or sour, then you get a large N400 because white is incongruent and sour is really anomalous. You don't say the Dutch strains are sour. If we say the peanut is in love, there's likewise a large N400 at the word in love. In Dutch, it's one word. But consider the following story. A woman saw a dancing peanut who had a big smile on his face. The peanut was singing about a girl he had just met. And judging from the song, the peanut was totally crazy about her. The peanut was in love. And by the sound of it, this was definitely mutual. He was seeing a little almond. Now in this context, the large N400 disappears. But if we instead said in this context, the peanut was salted, then you'd get a large N400. So you know that it is really measuring the congruity with the sentence. So the perception and comprehension appear to proceed in three distinct stages in time. First, to detect the word, the form of the word. Second, to recognize the meaning of the word. And third, to evaluate the word's meaning in the current context. And here is a similar MEG experiment, reading a word, a novel word that again produces an N400. Again, there are three distinct stages, but because it is MEG, we can see specific brain regions where these activations occur. So for stage 1, we have here at 115 milliseconds activation in the primary visual area associated with detecting the word percept, the form of the word. At stage 2, at 165 milliseconds, there's activation in the, this was earlier in the primary visual area. Now this is in the occipitotemporal area associated with detecting the meaning of the word, the concept. And these researchers noted that there is a very distinct pause between the end of stage 2 and the beginning of stage 3. And you can see it here in the plot of the activations. There is a pause. And then at stage 3 at N400, it peaks at N400, it builds to that. There's a activations that are associated with awareness of the context of how novel the word is from prior experience. So here, perception and comprehension appear to proceed in three distinct regions of the brain. And to give you a flavor for how this actually looks in your brain, we have two MEG, well, you have an MEG recording, one at real time and one at slowed down, reading a single word. And now notice that in this recording, the visual, the stage 1 is missing because the stage 1 occurs on the other side of the hemisphere, and this is only showing the outside lateral view. So the primary visual cortex is hidden. But then we have stage 2 at 165 and then stage 3 at 400. So here is the presentation of the activation in real time, reading one word. That was one word. It's 400 milliseconds. Okay. One more time, I think. All right, now I'm going to slow it down. So here it is slowed down. And we're starting at 100 milliseconds is missing. There's 165 peak at stage 2, and there's a peak at stage 3, moving on to to the end of stage 3. And to just show you that a little slower, I'm going to start it around here, and there's the beginning of stage 2, and then it reaches a peak right there, and then there's this pause, and then it reaches a peak here and moves on forward toward the rest of stage 3. We believe the pauses in neural activations are significant, that they are an actual reduction in neural activation caused by the mind's activity and engagement with the brain. And one more point about how the brain works, and then we'll move on to more interesting stuff, how it actually works. And that is, how long does it take to become aware? In the process of coming to conscious awareness, there's a paradox that was discovered by Benjamin Libet through a number of experiments. It takes time for neural activation to build up to conscious awareness. It takes time to become aware of something. Libet found that to achieve awareness requires a stimulus of a minimum or liminal intensity and neural activation after that stimulus for a minimum amount of time. Otherwise, no matter what happened to you, you aren't conscious of it. So you flash something, you didn't see it. You feel something, well, you don't feel it, but something touches you, but you don't feel it because it's below the stimulus level. If the stimulus is at or above liminal activity, you become aware of it only after 300 to 500 milliseconds, and this Libet called the time-on principle. But Libet distinguished between detection and conscious awareness. So even without conscious awareness, subliminal stimulations are detected and have an effect, even though you aren't consciously aware, and this is called priming. So the subject is unaware of the stimulus, but is more likely to respond later, showing that there was an influence of the subliminal stimulus. So so that there is some kind of subconscious consciousness. So the delay in awareness applies to all sensation, as Libet found in his experiments, and also to endogenous thoughts, volition, imaginations, and so on. So in our view, the primary purpose of neural activations is to bring mental content to conscious awareness. So all of the activity that's going on in your brain, the primary purpose, there are other purposes, but the primary purpose is to be aware, to stay aware, because you are aware all the time. The mind is engaged throughout the process, initially through detection and then actually coming to awareness. Oops, too far. So how does the mind actually interact with the brain to bring thoughts and perceptions to awareness? And here's how we bridge between the physical and the mental, the non-material mental. According to our theory, the indivisible non-material mind entity is ultimately united with the brain. Given what we know from NDEs and from Libet's work, the mind operates under the following constraints when in the body. So from NDEs, we know that all conceptual content resides in the mind. From Libet, we know that the mind requires neural activation to become aware of its own mental content. You need the neural activation. Therefore, the mind must first, the mind's got the content, remember, must first impress its conceptual content here on the appropriate brain regions. And the neural activation from those regions then acts as a mirror to bring the mind's conceptual content to consciousness. And here's a schematic view or exploded view of these interactions between the mind and the brain to demonstrate the activity of the mind and the brain during the pauses. In actuality, the mind is not separated from the brain, but we have to do it graphically this way. So at each stage, there's neural activity that induces detection or awareness in the mind. That's this top orange arrow. At each stage, the mind introduces or adds conceptual content, that's the yellow arrow, and then the mind impresses the new combined content on subsequent brain region. This activity, as this activity occurs, it acts as a mirror that induces neural activation in the new region, which is this red arrow, and then the mind acts as a mirror and induces awareness of the mental content in this from this new area in the mind, the bottom orange arrow. So here's how it works when you read a word. So in stage 1, this is a visual area. The activation of the primary sensory neurons in the mind detects the percept, causes the detection of the percept. In this orange arrow, the raw, uninterpreted sensory content, for example, the letters W-H-I-T-E. The conceptual content of the percept, the meaning of white, comes to the mind through intuition. And the perception, that is to say, this is the word white, the meaning of white, comes to the mind through intuition, and, the perception of the percept and the concept together is impressed on the subsequent neural structures, this red arrow. In stage 2, the activation of the second brain region mirrors the new mental content as activation, and the mind detects the perception. The meaning, which is now the meaning of white, and the integration of the meaning into the current context, the current context occurs, and you realize through your world knowledge, and that is impressed on the brain here, in this area, in the subsequent stage, going to be the subsequent stage. And it reflects the fit of the perception within the context, the N400. So white is an incongruous color for Dutch trains, inducing a large activation, N400. And finally, in stage 3, the activation of the third region here mirrors the new mental content, and the mind comes to awareness now of the incongruous white within the current context. The Dutch trains are, because the Dutch trains are not white. So notice that there is an interplay between alternating bottom-up processes, the orange arrows, and top-down processes, the yellow arrows and the red arrows. So here, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Another point is that the different brain regions are specialized to induce different mental content in the mind. So the different locations in the brain are activated for object recognition versus face recognition versus language comprehension versus working memory. Those are all different brain areas. How does it go? How does the mind know where to go? Well, the mind knows what it has perceived, and then it will activate that perception with the content of the concept in the appropriate brain region. The mind is engaged throughout the process of coming to awareness, but awareness does not occur actually until stage 3. So this is detection, and then finally awareness. So the results of the 3 stages in the mind are to detect the percept, the raw percept, to detect the meaning of the percept, so now we have the concept, and then to become aware of the meaning in context. So that's how it works. The question naturally arises, what is the interface between the mind and the brain? Because this is an important question. Okay, it's got to interact somehow. First, in order to have consciousness, the neural activations must work energetically to induce detection and awareness in the mind. So this is the brain making something happen in the mind. It's a brain-to-mind interface, and this would be in our diagrams the orange arrows. Secondly, in order to have mental content, the mind must work energetically with the neurons to induce neural electrical firing or action potentials, and that's the mind working on the brain, and those are the red arrows. So very briefly, how do you get the orange arrows and the red arrows? We believe that both interfaces are in the apical dendrites. of the pyramidal neurons in the gray matter of the surface of the cortex. And so how does the mind detect what is happening? It is through the mind can sense the neural activations from backward propagations of action potentials in the apical dendrites. And how does the mind induce electrical activity? It happens that the apical dendrites, they have innumerable bumps or processes called dendritic spines, which contain ion channels, and our proposal is that the mind can alter the molecular configuration of the ion channels in those dendritic spines to open them and trigger neural activation, and that would not require a large amount of energy. So this model of the mind entity is applicable to all conscious experience. This is the way consciousness works. Now, there are two distinct complementary brain networks that have been identified, and that's shown in these two sides, aspects of the brain. So here is the outside side, or the lateral side of the left hemisphere, and here is the medial side, or the inside side of the left hemisphere. So you can see the one side and then the other side. And the two complementary areas are a externally directed perceptual system, shown in the yellow, that involves external sensory and motor processes and involving a minimal semantic content. Those are the yellow areas. And then there is an internally directed conceptual system used in semantic tasks, what is also called the default network, and these are the red areas, and they are for almost entirely independent. There's only a little bit of overlap. Both networks are involved in perception, as we saw in the MEG example. If you go back to that and take a look at what areas were activated with the perception part versus the mental part. And because it's called a default network, because it is also active when we are engaged not in perception but in inward endogenous mental activity. So for example, when you are lost in thought, when you are daydreaming, when you're trying to solve a mental problem, when you're rehearsing what to say to the boss, you are focused inward and your mind is working, and it's these red areas that are activated. When you're out looking in the world, then both of these areas are involved, because you're seeing things and then you're understanding what you're seeing. So in the mind entity, we are proposing the mind is engaged in both networks, effectively throughout the cortex. With external sensory and motor processes, the mind brings perceptions to consciousness across all sensory modalities, hearing, vision, taste, and touch, and so on, and coordinates motor interactions with the external environment. With internal sources of information, the mind brings semantic knowledge, simulations, imaginations, future plans, episodic memories to consciousness. So that's your inner mental life. And the mind, of course, is engaged in both. Now, this theory is a radical departure from current neuroscientific thinking. These are just some of the major differences. In current neuroscience, neuroactivations are considered calculations on neural representations of mental content. And in our theory, the neural activations, as I said earlier, enable detection and awareness of mental content. There are no neural representations. The conceptual content is in the mind, and it is impressed on the brain. In current neuroscience, semantic and world knowledge are globally encoded as neural representations in the brain, but there's no neuroscientist who can give you a mechanism where that happens, how that happens, all across the brain where you get the mental content, semantic content. And in current neuroscience, higher frequencies of neural activations represent conscious mental functions. Well, in our view, the natural frequency of mind-brain interaction is the theta frequency. Higher frequencies, like likely implement mechanisms under the mind's volitional control. For example, alpha and gamma frequencies inhibit input and focus attention. Beta oscillations facilitate motor activity. And finally, in current neuroscience, episodic memories are encoded in the hippocampus as long-term potentiations, alterations of neural connections. In our view, episodic memories are formed in the mind and recalled in the mind from the mind through the hippocampus, but the long-term potentiations are really just common pathways in memory formation and recall. So all good theories provide explanatory power. The better the theory, the more explanatory power it has. So in this theory, we explain nearly all aspects of NDEs. And in this theory, we answer many of the general enigmas of consciousness. So the hard problem of consciousness is not really that hard. The question is, how does brain electrical activity turn into subjective phenomenal experience? Is actually pretty easy because the brain doesn't produce subjective experience. The mind working with the brain is conscious. And likewise, the binding problem is similarly, how do the separate elements of perception get unified as a whole picture? That is also easy because phenomenal experience is unified in the mind. And then we answer a number of other interesting neurological phenomena and anomalies and disorders. Suzanne will now present some supporting evidence for this theory from philosophy and then the greater implications of NDEs from esoteric wisdom.
We have tried to show from a neuroscientific basis how the mind provides the structured component to perception. This idea is not new, as we will now hear from a philosophical perspective. More than 120 years ago, the philosopher and spiritual scientist Rudolf Steiner wrote his major work, The Philosophy of Freedom, based on his introspection and insights into the nature of thinking and perception. Rudolf Steiner's insights are derived from his spiritual scientific research in a time long before the technology of brain imaging. His understanding bears a striking similarity to the observations found today in a number of auditory and visual mental processes, such as rapid visual categorization, face recognition, and language comprehension. Rudolf Steiner's insight into the mind-body connection is that due to our unusual mental organization, the perceiver receives two aspects of reality in perception. One aspect of reality comes from perceiving through the physical senses, and the other aspect of reality comes from thinking through intuition. In Chapter 5 of his Philosophy of Freedom, Rudolf Steiner indicates this twofold nature of perception. It goes like this. It is due to our mental organization that the outer world is given to us, at first, without its corresponding concepts. Secondly, intuition adds that part of the reality, the concept, which is lacking in the percept. The thinking human being then weaves the two together to arrive at recognition and knowledge. Quote, from every real thing, the relevant elements come to us from two sides, from perceiving and from thinking. The moment a perception rises up on the horizon of my observation, thinking also becomes active through me. An entity within my system of thoughts, a particular intuition, a concept, joins itself to the perception. The act of knowing or cognition is the synthesis of percept and concept. Rudolf Steiner acknowledged the necessity of a brain for embodied consciousness with the statement, "For this life, man needs the physical brain as an instrument of consciousness. Without it, man cannot be conscious." And at the same time, he identified that the mind needs to repress brain activity by saying, quote, "The essence which is active in thinking has a twofold function. First, thinking activity represses the activity of the human organization. Secondly, it replaces that activity with its own activity. The repression of the physical organization prepares the way for thinking to manifest." We propose that this process of repression happens in the pauses that occur between the stages of neural activations. The insertion of the combined perceptual and conceptual content is followed immediately by neural activation in a different region that then brings combined mental content to detection or awareness. The effect of one's thinking activity can be seen more easily when the concept of the image is not readily available to us. For example, in this hidden image, where the given blotches at first don't mean anything. If the image appears meaningless, this is because the mind has not parsed it into meaningful segments. What we see is pure content of observation, a bare aggregate without interconnections, before thinking is brought into activity, when a point of attack is found. Until one's thinking can bring the unifying concept through intuition, the image remains unsegmented and unintelligible, a mere juxtaposition in space and succession in time, an aggregate of particulars without interconnection. This is the percept without its concept. Once the concept dawns on us, the concept instantly organizes the image. Then it becomes impossible not to see the figure in the image. As a summary of this polarity between observation and thinking, Rudolf Steiner says the following: "An occurrence or object that is merely observed does not of itself reveal anything about its connection with other occurrences or objects. This connection becomes visible only when observation joins itself with thinking. Without thinking, the world is a multiplicity of objects of equal value. Objects remain unintelligible to us until we have within ourselves the corresponding intuition, which adds that part of the reality which is lacking in the percept. Without the intuitions corresponding to the things, the full reality remains inaccessible." We can see this fact here with this hidden image. Out of the world of concepts, thinking brings content to meet the perception. So it's reasonable that we come to perceive and know external reality through two faculties, sense perception and thinking. One faculty is physiological, and the other is spiritual activity. The mind-entity hypothesis in our presentation maintains that the essence of the human being is an autonomous, non-material mind or psyche comprising the seat of a person's consciousness. This individualized, self-motivated consciousness interfaces and is active within the physical body and brain, enabling a person to be aware of the world and inner experiences. The activity of observation and of thinking by the mind entity are spiritual activities and are the two starting points for all the spiritual striving of the embodied human being. Science can bridge to spirituality. Both are disciplines for gaining knowledge that then can cast light on the ideal image of the human being and on existential questions about the purpose of life on earth, about the meaning of sickness, pain, suffering, old age, death. People who have had a near-death experience declare, "We do not die." Their NDE erases all fear of dying. They know beyond any doubt that human beings are eternal spiritual beings who merely undergo at death a transition from one state of body-bound consciousness to an ultra-lucid, more real than real, body-free, eternal consciousness. NDEers know firsthand that the ultimate purpose of life is love. Unconditional, all-inclusive, never ending. Their NDE also shows them that every person is born with a life plan of lessons to learn, the foremost lesson being to learn to love. The phenomena of NDEs will be instrumental in awakening humanity as a whole to what the ancient mysteries and Western and Eastern esotericism teach, that human consciousness is evolving to spiritualize the individual and earth. From Rudolf Steiner, we learned that in primeval times, quote, human beings had spirit without intellect. Then the spirit gradually fell away and the intellect increased. Now, by means of the intellect, we have to regain the spirit. Culture is obliged to take this course, unquote, in order for humanity to evolve into self-actualized, individualized ego consciousness. Sri Aurobindo refers to, quote, an evolution of consciousness in matter, in a constant developing self-formation, till the form can reveal the indwelling spirit, which is then the keynote, the central significant motive of the terrestrial existence. The Gnostic individual would be in the world and of the world, but would also exceed it in his consciousness and live in his self of transcendence above it. He would be universal, but free in the universe, individual, but not limited by separative individuality. In esoteric traditions, the spirit world is comprised of manifold, differentiated, hierarchical beings. To begin with, angels, archangels, archai, with whom human beings need to reestablish a direct living interconnection if the world is to move forward towards its ascent and not its decline. Sri Aurobindo saw the human being as a God in the making. Rudolf Steiner saw the human being becoming an angel in due season. For Sri Aurobindo, the human being's aspiration to spiritual mastery and transmutation of nature through the will of the individuated self leads to a psychic prevision of a fulfillment exceeding the individual transformation. A new earth and heaven, a city of God, a divine descent of the spiritually perfect, a kingdom of God not only within us, but outside in a collective human life. For Rudolf Steiner, in the future, love will reveal itself in all phenomena as a new nature force. It is the mystery of all evolution into the future, that knowledge and all that the human being does through a true understanding of evolution is a sowing of a seed that must ripen as love, and the culminating result of spiritualization. Man will draw along with him the lower beings of the earth, and will thus transform the whole earth. In a remote future, he will transform the entire substance of the earth. In these teachings, each human being is on a path of self-development, for not only learning to love as NDEs affirm, but to freely choose unconditional love. The angels, archangels, and archai do not experience the trials of earthly life, illness, pain, old age, and death, nor drink the draught of spirit forgetfulness at birth. But they cannot freely choose to love, because they are compelled by divine glory and bliss to love. These heavenly beings await this new spiritual capacity of freely chosen love that humanity will bring to them, a goal that will necessitate many more lifetimes of human incarnation on earth. In the meantime, the revelation of freely chosen unconditional love can begin to unravel the riddles of good and evil and other existential questions about the purpose and direction of life on earth. The source of this unconditional love is a spiritual light being, more brilliant than 1,000 suns, as NDEs say, who is united with the earth and guiding humanity toward ethical individualism and all that can be thought, felt, and willed. That's the end of our presentation.